another in a series of presidential profiles. Rutherford B. Hayes, 19th President of the United States.
It has been reserved for a government of the people, where the right of suffrage is universal, to give to the world the first example in history of a great nation in the midst of the struggle of opposing political parties for power, hushing its party tumults to yield the issue of the presidential contest to the decision of a tribunal.
Rutherford B. Hayes reached the presidency after the most fiercely disputed election in American history. He entered the White House under a cloud of controversy that never entirely lifted. But Hayes, a man of dignity and honesty, rose above that controversy to win the support of the American people. Born in Ohio in 1822, Hayes was raised in wealth and comfort by a bachelor uncle. A diligent, studious child, Hayes compiled an outstanding record at Kenyon College and Harvard Law School. Hayes knew the value of discipline and hard work. He knew that scholastic honors and awards were worthless unless they were earned and deserved.
Defeat without disgrace can be borne, but laurels which are not deserved sit like a crown of thorns on the head of their possessor. It is indeed far better to deserve honors without having them than to have them without deserving them.
Hayes soon established himself as a talented young lawyer, and as his business prospered, his political stock also rose. But although he worked for the newly formed Republican Party and spoke out against slavery, Hayes refused to run for office. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the burning fires of dissent and passion at last erupted into civil war, and Rutherford B. Hayes enlisted in the Union Army. Hayes felt the cause was just. "I would rather die," he said, "than stay out of it."
If this were merely a war of conquest, I would oppose it. But the war is forced upon us. We cannot escape it. I do not undertake to predict what will be the ultimate object of the war. Its present object, and its obvious present effect, is to defend the rights of the Union. We were becoming a disgraced, demoralized people. We are now united and strong.
Civil War changed the life and personality of Hayes, as it did the lives of countless others in both the North and South. Hayes diligently applied himself to learning the art of war and soon established himself as a skillful leader. Though he saw only limited action, he was twice wounded and rose to the rank of brigadier general. In 1864, while the war was still in progress, Hayes was nominated as a candidate for Congress. Hayes refused to leave his army post to campaign for office. His first duty was on the front lines.
Sir, do you intend to campaign for Congress?
An officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to campaign for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped.
Despite his refusal to campaign, Hayes was elected by a heavy majority and took his seat in the House of Representatives after the war had ended. Through the next 10 years, Hayes served in Congress and as governor of Ohio, briefly returning to private life as a lawyer. During this time, the gloomy storm clouds of revenge dominated the political air as vengeful politicians sought to punish the South. Although more restrained than the ultra-radicals of the North, Hayes was a faithful party man. He supported the Reconstruction program of the extremists. Hayes honestly felt that the South could not be trusted.
Until the work of Reconstruction is complete, until every question arising out of the rebellion relating to the integrity of the nation and to human rights has been settled, and settled rightly, no man ought to be trusted with power in this country who during the struggle for the nation's life was unfaithful to union and liberty.
But in 1876, the political fate of presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes would ride on the votes of those same Southerners. Their support would decide the most disputed presidential election in the history of the United States. In 1876, the voters seemed ready for a change. The scandals of President Grant's administration had shocked the nation. And when the returns were in, Rutherford B. Hayes believed he had lost the election to the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden. And indeed, Tilden did poll 300,000 more popular votes than Hayes. Then a startling development as charges of vote fraud filled the air. The electoral votes of 3 southern states were contested. Immediately, Hayes and his backers moved to win the support of those southern votes.
Let me assure my countrymen of the southern states that if I shall be charged with the duty of organizing an administration, it will be one which will regard and cherish the truest interests of the South, and which will put forth its best efforts in behalf of a civil policy which will wipe out forever the distinction between North and South in our common country.
The country was in an uproar. Who was really the President of the United States? Further confusing the issue was the fact that the Constitution contained no provision to cover the situation. Behind the scenes, negotiations continued between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats. Promises and compromises flowed freely, and Hayes began to gain support. Although he firmly believed that a voting fraud had occurred, Hayes did not condone some of the more devious efforts of his backers.
I shall tell you how I feel about this whole business. A fair election would have given us about 40 electoral votes in the South. At least that many. But we are not to allow our friends to defeat one outrage and fraud by another. There must be nothing crooked on our part.
Finally, in January of 1877, Congress appointed an electoral commission to rule on the disputed votes. And when the commission made its final rulings 2 days before the inaugural, the electoral vote stood 185 to 184 in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the 19th President of the United States. Hayes immediately fulfilled his pledge to the South by withdrawing federal troops from rebel states. The curtain of radical Reconstruction was ringing down.
The discontinuance of the use of the Army for the purpose of upholding local governments in 2 southern states is a much-needed measure for the restoration of local self-government and the promotion of national harmony.
The politicians who had maneuvered Hayes into the White House eagerly looked forward to the rewards of patronage. But President Hayes turned his back on them. He chose men of high caliber to serve in his cabinet. He tried to carry out his inaugural pledge to reform the civil service system.
We will seek a civil service organized upon a system which will secure purity, experience, efficiency, and economy. A strict regard for the public welfare solely in appointments, and the speedy, thorough, and unsparing prosecution and punishment of all public officers who betray official trusts.
Although Congress refused to enact the reforms presented by the President, Hayes continued to gain stature in the eyes of the public. Great forces were changing the face of American society. Reconstruction was ending, and the economic problems of the Industrial Revolution were pushing into the limelight. Hayes met the issues of the day not with brilliant daring, but with courage and determination. In 1880, however, he refused to run for re-election. He had earlier pledged not to seek a second term, believing that he could accomplish more reform programs if he were free from political obligations.
Sir, do you intend to run for re-election?
Believing that reform can best be accomplished by an executive who is under no temptation to use the patronage of his office to promote his own re-election, I desire to perform what I regard as a duty in stating now my inflexible purpose not to be a candidate for election to a second term.
Hayes kept his promise, retiring to his Ohio estate, where he spent the last years of his life completely divorced from politics. His political career had been short, spanning less than 15 years, and he had been involved in the most heated election in history. But he had also contributed a measure of strength to the presidency when the office was at one of its lowest levels. His claim to national leadership would always be disputed, but his efforts in behalf of his nation would never be questioned.
The administration found the country divided and distracted and every interest depressed. It left it united, harmonious, and prosperous. I can say with truth, I left this great country prosperous and happy, and the party of my choice strong, victorious, and united. In serving the country, I served the party.
Another in the series of presidential profiles, James A. Garfield, 20th President of the United States.
There are times in the history of men and nations when they stand so near the veil that separates mortals from the immortals, time from eternity, and men from their God, that they can almost hear the beatings and feel the pulsations of the heart of the infinite. Through such a time as this nation passed in the great Civil War,
A powerful combination of religious fervor, oratorical skills, and political ambition. These were the ingredients that propelled James A. Garfield from a log cabin in Ohio to the presidency of the United States. Fatherless in 1833, when he was less than 2 years old, Garfield's boyhood was one of hard work on the farm and on the Ohio canals. He wanted an education above everything, and he strove to master all the knowledge there was to learn.
I was a very wordy boy till I was at least 22 years old. But with all the crudeness of those times, I was dead in earnest and working with the best light I had.
At the age of 17, Garfield attended a Baptist seminary in Ohio, then sandwiched several years of college around a teaching career. At the same time, his talent for public speaking and involvement in church work made it appear likely that preaching might become his lifelong vocation. In 1859, he reached a crossroads point in his life. Would he be an educator, a preacher, or a politician? Garfield chose politics and was elected to the Ohio State Senate.
I am convinced that I can enter political life and retain my integrity manhood, and religion. I believe that there's vastly more need of manly men in politics than preachers.
The clouds of secession hung over the country, and Garfield strongly advocated forcing the rebel states to remain in the Union. When Civil War broke out, Garfield was placed in command of an Ohio volunteer company. At a time when Union victories were few, Garfield defeated a small Confederate force in Kentucky.
Soldiers of the 18th Brigade, I'm proud of you all. With no experience but the consciousness of your manhood, you have driven the enemy from his stronghold, compelling him to flee by the light of his burning stores, and to leave even the banner of his rebellion behind. I greet you as brave men.
Promoted to the rank of Major General, Garfield resigned his commission in 1863 to take a seat in the United States Congress. A strong supporter of Lincoln's war policies, Garfield was deeply affected by the assassination of the president in 1865. 2 days later, however, Garfield's ringing oratory prevented a bloody riot in New York City as 50,000 angry citizens milled around the Custom House crying for vengeance.
Fellow citizens, clouds and darkness are round about him. His pavilion is dark waters and thick clouds of the sky. Justice and judgment are the establishment of his throne. Mercy and truth shall go before his face. Fellow citizens, God reigns, and the government at Washington still lives.
But the halting of this riot proved only a lull before the storm, as a thirst for revenge began to spread through the North. Lincoln's plea for orderly and humane Reconstruction was forgotten, and James Garfield became one of the leading spokesmen for a Congress seeking to punish the traitors of the South.
It was no one man who killed Abraham Lincoln. It was the embodied spirit of treason and slavery, inspired with fearful and despairing hate, that struck him down in the moment of the nation's supremest joy.
Lincoln had hoped to bind up the nation's wounds. Andrew Johnson had sought to follow Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. But radical leaders of Congress wanted revenge. Congressman James A. Garfield, partly because of his hatred of slavery and love for the Union, raised his powerful voice against the defeated Confederacy. He advocated the confiscation of rebel lands.
We must take away the platform on which slavery stands. The great landed estates of the armed rebels of the South.
Many Southern leaders aggravated their cause by imposing new post-war restrictions on their former slaves. The Negro was free in name only, and the Northern radicals used this as an excuse to impose a military rule over the Southern states.
We can hold the insurgent states in military subjection half a century, if need be, until they are purged of their poison and stand up clean before the country.
The Southern radicals demanded a return to the conditions that had existed before the war. They would accept the equal rights of the Negro in their own way.
They must give us proof, strong as Holy Writ, that they have washed their hands and are worthy again to be trusted.
For the next 15 years, Garfield served in the House of Representatives as the fever of revenge reached its peak, broke, then gradually subsided, leaving in its aftermath a bitterness and mistrust that was to survive for years to come. Garfield had followed the policies of his party on Reconstruction, as he did also on the matters of sound money and high tariffs. His love for education, however, spurred an individual crusade for its advancement.
We must build up free states on the ruins of slavery and extend to every inhabitant of the United States the rights and privileges of citizenship. How shall it be done? We must pour upon them all the light of our public schools.
In 1880, Garfield was selected as the Republican candidate for president and was elected to the White House by a popular majority of only 10,000 votes, less than 1/10 of 1%. As has so often happened in our history, the elevation to the presidency changed Garfield's political outlook, and he turned his back on the bosses who ruled the party. He denounced the patronage or spoils system and demanded reform in the civil service.
Once or twice I felt like crying out, the agony of my soul, against the greed for office and its consumption of my time. Some civil service reform will come by necessity after the wearisome years of wasted presidents have paved the way for it.
His words were prophetic. 3 months after taking office, James A. Garfield was fatally shot by an unsuccessful office seeker who felt that the spoils system should have provided him with a job. Garfield died 80 days later, the second president to be assassinated. His death stirred the nation and Congress to action, and a civil service reform law was passed less than 2 years later. In death, Garfield had achieved his final goal, a place in history, in a country whose future he believed was limitless.
Secure against dangers from abroad, united at home by the strongest ties of common interest and patriotic pride, holding and unifying our vast territory by the most potent forces of civilization, relying upon the intelligent strength and responsibility of each citizen, and most of all, upon the power of truth, we may hope that in the centuries to come, our republic will continue to live and hold its high place among the nations as the heir of all the ages in the foremost files of time.